All right. Hey, welcome to the 2 o'clock show of Ward Wrestling Live here on Ward Wrestling Live. I guess that's what it's called. So I'm here with an amazing a wrestling mind in our country, a wrestling historian, the former director for over a decade of the National Hall of Fame and the Dan Gable Museum, author of several books, and the current content producer for Track Wrestling and a podcast producer also called On the Mat over at Track Wrestling, which we'll talk about. But we've got him here live with us today. Thank you so much, Mr. Kyle Klingman. How are you, sir?
Good, man. I appreciate this. And I'll tell you what, it's kind of hard for me not to want to turn this around and interview you after learning your story, after learning you've been in this for only 2 years and how you've kind of grown this. So you have a great story too, and I hope people appreciate that. But I certainly appreciate you having me on here.
Yeah, man, anytime. I like beer, so we can share one and talk about it. But yeah, anytime anytime you want to talk. But yeah, thank you for that. First of all, I know that you're obviously involved in producing content and track wrestling, things like that, but also your lifeblood is wrestling. And if there's no wrestling going on, your blood's not dripping, I'm sure. So talk a little bit about what kind of effect this kind of pandemic has on someone your caliber in the sport.
For me, it's had not a positive effect, but I've really enjoyed this time because it's allowed me to connect with some projects and just be able to get some interviews that maybe you don't get when you have current wrestling happening at the time. So it's allowed me to just interview some people I've always wanted to, and maybe there wasn't that outlet. So that's really been fun for me, and just allows you to open your mind and reflect and think about what you want to do in the future. So there's just been a lot of good with what's happened in the quarantine from that point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't want wrestling there. I know that some of the junior duels and things that were going to happen during this time and junior nationals, that's all happening, or we're missing that right now. So certainly miss that. But it's been fun to catch your breath and just connect with some people I haven't for a while.
Man, very cool. So I know you were involved with a lot of other big magazines and big names, and then you decided to make the transition now to joining Track Wrestling. They also brought on another gentleman on the marketing aspect side of it, I saw. And but talk about that transition and what it meant for you and what made you decide finally, Track Wrestling is going to be my new home.
It was a tough decision, I'll tell you that. It wasn't easy to make that because I do love the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum and the opportunities it gave me and what I was able to do there. But Andy Hamilton, who's the content manager, was actually working out of the museum, and we hosted the On the Mat podcast. And if you go back before that, when he got hired, he approached me and said, "Hey, you remember when you said that you don't want to let me out of the state?" He said, "Well, there's an opportunity for me to be a Track Wrestling. Could I office out of the Gable Museum?" And I said, sure, he could. And so it just worked out that we had been friends prior to that. But when that job opening came, he leaned on me, and he did a great job of really talking me to the virtues. And I saw the outline, and it just felt like it was me and what fit what I wanted to do. So I really appreciate Andy believing in me for that role, and getting to work with him has been fantastic. So really appreciate that opportunity. I just love being able to tell people stories, and this opportunity as content producer really fits that role very well. So I've enjoyed that part of it.
Very cool. Yeah. And I know on that platform, you have your very own podcast that you do called On the Mat Podcast. Now, is that a podcast that started prior to you coming and you brought it with you, or was that something that was planned to start on the Track platform?
It's been had a lot of iterations, really. It started when the museum that I worked for went from Newton, Iowa to Waterloo, Iowa. So when it moved, starting January 2007, we started a live radio show called On the Mat. And so it was just live locally. And then Jason Bryant, who has Mat Talk Online, he just started recording it and posting it on USA Wrestling. And so we were able to have a podcast form of it. And Jason and I worked together for a year with a project called Wrestling 411 out of the Twin Cities. So we had that, and then it just took some different forms. It started getting better. We started going more podcast form. We ditched the live version here in Cedar Falls, Waterloo, and then we just went with the podcast, Andy and I, and now it's the iteration you are talking about today. It's a podcast form exclusively called On the Mat. We now host it on Track Wrestling.
Nice. And you do it, and you, I see that there's videos. So are you doing it live, or are you going out and meeting with people and then posting it afterwards?
The videos are separate, so that's not necessarily the On the Mat. So the video portion are just interviews that I've conducted, and then the On the Mat's just strictly a podcast. Now, at some point, we would like to get to that point where maybe we do some of the live feeds and do some of that and have that broadcast live, kind of like what you're doing. But for right now, it's recorded video interviews, and then we record the podcast called On the Mat.
Yeah, and I definitely see that. There's been, you and I were talking earlier before we jumped on, and it's been obviously a lot easier to do live right now. But I can definitely see how when I transition to kind of getting out and about, how it's going to be like, hey, look, that's Kyle Klingman sitting in the stands. I'm going to go sit next to him, and maybe he'll do an interview with me, and I'll just have to hit record on my phone and then post it later. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of that taking place more when I get out there, or maybe phone calls where I can get on to Anchor or something like that, and use that type of platform, which I'm sure you have some sort of platform you're using. I found Anchor worked for me. It kind of spreads it into different podcasts for me. So I'm not, listen, I'm a high school graduate who worked my whole life for 20 years in the car business. So every day that I've been doing this since April 6th, I've learned something new about, hey, let me try that, or let me try this. So everything's been kind of self-taught. So I'm kind of just learning and talking to guys like you that have done this for a while, and getting your content is pretty cool. So awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing more of that on the Matt podcast, and I'll have to get on there, and I'll have to go onto my Apple and my Spotify and save it there so I can grab it. But you spent a decade at the Hall of Fame, the Dan Gable Museum. I know you've built up a huge relationship with him. Excuse me, I apologize. First of all, talk about your decade at the Hall of Fame. That had to be pretty cool. Probably had to, I mean, obviously you're a historian of the sport, so you obviously met a lot of people, but you probably had to do a lot of writing for them, and things that go on for them. But then getting to be, rub shoulders with a guy like Dan Gable and sharing a book with him and things like that. That's talk about your experience there. That was pretty cool.
It was a lot of fun. I think especially because when you grow up and looking back, I think a lot of people thought I was crazy for going all in on wrestling, and I didn't know where it was going to lead. I didn't know that a position like this would ever be available at some point, because when I'm in junior high school, just like you just turned 44. I'm 44. There wasn't internet, and you didn't have email. I mean, you couldn't imagine a track wrestling coming up and that you're going to live stream. It was all magazines and just repetition and books. So my high school and college, I don't like to admit that, but I spent way too much time studying wrestling and not enough time with my schoolwork. So it would just be going to the library, and I would get on something called LexisNexis and just research and read the same article over and over and over, and find out information and read things and talk to people. So that was kind of like my education, and it fortunately played out with this job. And when we did the book with Dan Gable, my parents thought, I didn't find out till later, my parents thought I was crazy that I was doing all that. So I'm glad it worked out. I'm glad I didn't know they thought I was nuts for being all in on wrestling at the time. But it's been fun. I mean, when you grow up in Iowa, especially Waterloo, Iowa, you know about the name Dan Gable. He is larger than life. He, in some ways, embodies the sport. He is the sport. And to eventually build a relationship where you're the director of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum, you get to co-write a book with him and get to take trips with him and do all of these different things and just see a different side of him. It's rewarding. I mean, and you get to be around that, and you absorb why he's so great, and hopefully you internalize some of the things that made him great, and you can add it to your own arsenal.
Yeah, and like I told you, I had Coach Weber on this week, and I said to him, before I even found wrestling, I knew who Dan Gable. You know the name Dan Gable, unless you're dead in the United States. I mean, everybody who came up in any sport or was watching the Olympics or was involved in anything, you knew who Dan Gable was. And So pretty cool there. Where did your love from wrestling come from?
Couple things. My mom is from Stillwater, Oklahoma, so she grew up around the Oklahoma State wrestlers, and so our family vacations were to Stillwater, Oklahoma, where Oklahoma State is, and we'd go to the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And back then, before it was renovated, they had these phones with the distinguished members. You'd listen to their bio on the phone, and I can remember doing that. I love that. My dad went to Northern Iowa, even though he didn't wrestle. We'd go up to University of Northern Iowa wrestling meets. But really, a guy named Doug Van Gelder, who was close by here, he just started taking me to meets. And our high school, Cedar Falls High School, was winning state championships at the time. So that really fed into it. And these guys were larger than life. And so I got to see my friends and people I was in high school with win state championships. And that I really took off there. And then Doug took me to my first national tournament in '95. And I haven't missed since. Of course, they canceled this year and missed that one, but so did everyone else. But it just took off from there, and I couldn't get enough of it. I just wanted more, watch more. And then when you're around it and you have a good base, it's not like I'm growing up in Mississippi where you don't have access to it, but I have access to Wartburg, Northern Iowa, Iowa State, and all of the surrounding community is so solid in wrestling. So it just fit.
One other question I had, and I know we were getting to that, was you had wrote an article about what it takes to be great and kind of the work ethic behind it and things like that. But true or false, great in high school equals a great career?
False. I think anytime you think you're great in any moment, it doesn't equate. Like I think even if you say a great freshman year means it's going to be a great sophomore year, I think it's even harder to get to that next level. So I don't think you can ever rest. I think you have to live in the moment. And I think that's one of the things I've seen as you talk about Gable and these greats is that they never settle. So to get to that next level, say you're an undefeated 4-time state champion, that does not mean it's going to translate, just like it doesn't mean Stephen Neal, who's one of my favorite wrestlers. He's a world champion, went on to play 10 years in the NFL, didn't have a down of college football experience, but won 3 Super Bowl rings with the Patriots. He got 4th in state in California and then went on to win 2 NCAA titles and become a world champion. So can you make some predictors and say that guy could be pretty good? Yeah, I mean, you can say that, but there's certain things that have to happen. Even if you are undefeated and 4-time state champion, you have to do certain things in college to be able to win a national championship and do certain things. So if it equated that way, every 4-time state champion would be a 4-time national champion, and we know that's not the case.
No, not at all. Well, all right. Well, I've got these 10 questions for you to wrap it up and and then get you on your way. I know you got things to do. So are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. The Dan Schultz or the Bill Farrell?
The Dan Schultz, you mean Dave Schultz?
Dave Schultz. I'm sorry. Dave Schultz or the Bill Farrell?
I'm going with Bill Farrell.
All right. Scotcheroos or Dutch letters?
I don't know what either are, but I like Scotcheroos, just the sound of it. So I'm going with that.
Oh, all right. Pan Ams or Cadet Worlds?
Cadet Worlds.
Tenderloin or Iowa chops?
Iowa chops.
Reno or Body Bar?
Body bar.
Made right or fried catfish?
Made right.
Tulsa or Dixie Nationals?
Tulsa.
Taco pizza or breakfast pizza?
Taco pizza.
Fargo or 32?
Fargo.
Blarney Stones or Bluebell?
I don't know either, but so I'm going Blarney Stones.
It's a dessert in Iowa, I guess.
Is it? I don't know what that is. Never heard of that.
Yeah, I guess Blarney Stones is like some type of cake with icing and nuts on top or something. And obviously Bluebell's an ice cream. But yeah, that was fun. And thank you so much for coming on, man. I do appreciate it. And sorry about the getting cut off there with the power loss. But I guess I'll have to share this as like Kyle Klingman part 2 or something like that. But we'll get it figured out and we'll get it up and running. And I look forward to talking to you again sometime, man. I'll private message you my cell, or you can grab it right off my page here and we can keep in touch.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing your story. I was intrigued by that. It's so cool that again, you're in it 2 years and now you're hooked and doing podcasts and doing live radio. That just shows the power of wrestling. So you're everything that's right with the sport. I don't think there's many sports that you can be in it 2 years and fall in love with it this quick. So you're what this sport's all about.
Well, I appreciate it, man, and maybe one day I can get on the mat.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Let's do that. Yeah, or we can do an interview for Track Wrestling. It'd be cool.
For sure. Thank you so much, man. You have a great day, and look forward to getting wrestling back in here.
All right, no more storms.
No more storms.